I am impressed when I looked through the speakers and other themes in the program, and I'm very honored to open this conference today. And I already addressed also thanks to the docent Daniel Acqua and his team. It is also a great honor for me to introduce the first keynote, Professor Ruth L. Okediji, whose topic will be From Minimalist to Maximalist and Back, the subversive pathways of technical assistance in intellectual property law making. Professor Okediji is the Jeremiah Smith Junior Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and co-director of the Bergman Klein Center. She is known as a renowned scholar in international intellectual property law and a leading authority on the role of intellectual property in social and economic development. Her widely cited research on IP and development has influenced governmental policies in Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and South America. Her ideas have helped to shape national strategies for implementing the TRIPS agreement, for example. We are extremely honored to have you here, Professor Okediji, and I invite you to deliver your paper. Please.
I'm told that recording will start at 9:30, so I'm actually not allowed to speak until 9:30. So you can all keep yourselves busy for about 3 minutes. Mm-hmm.
Should we be plugging it into the projector?
It's up to you. Do you want to plug it into?
You cannot do that because of the recording.
Oh, okay, I see.
See, it's PowerPoint presentation, so you try to save it as a PowerPoint presentation.
I can save it again.
It's not that one.
Yeah, it's this one.
Okay. Shall we try it again?
Yeah.
Maybe we just missed it.
Yeah. There you go.
Cheers.
Use this to forward the slides.
All right.
What time is it?
Is it 9:30? 1 more minute. Okay.
Tell us some jokes while we're waiting.
You really don't want to hear my jokes. That would send everybody to sleep. I guess I can say thank you. And one thing that I do, Daniel, thank you so much for this invitation, and Amma and the entire team, Dr. Morris, thank you so much. You didn't tell me how much time I have, and I can talk all day. hour solid or 45 minutes in Q&A?
Yes, 45 minutes.
And Q&A. Okay, great, great. Emma, is it 9:30? Okay.
Recording is awesome.
The recording is on. Great, thanks so much. So I'm going to just re-echo my thanks to the dean. I had a chance to speak with him a few minutes before we started, and I realized that he is both a lawyer and a historian. Learned a lot about Turku from him, and I'm just so delighted. To all the students in the room, you are a dream come true. When I first started studying intellectual property, I was the only one in my entire class who was interested in the subject matter. This was a very long time ago. And it always felt like a lonely field. And so it's just a joy and an honor to be here and to see all these young folks who are interested in this field and who are learning as a cohort together. So thank you for being here. I'm not sure that Daniel has ever shared with me or in our various emails has ever talked about why he chose this topic and how he, in fact, landed on a research project to study this. But technical assistance has been a thorn in my side for almost 4 decades. In my early years as a scholar, I would think about it and then push it to the side because there was just so much work to be done and an incredible amount of questions that were left unanswered in the literature. And one thing that I do want to thank both the dean, the University of Turku, Daniel, and the team about is that you've chosen a subject matter that I think is key to all that we study in global intellectual property relations. I think I saw Peter Yu, and I know my dear friend Justin is here, and those who have studied international intellectual property will tell you that a good deal of our normative expectations and our practical experiences tie back to this question of technical assistance. And yet, even as I was preparing for this keynote, as we read all of the literature, very little is in fact written, either on the theory of technical assistance, its practical implications, lessons. The literature is actually quite sparse when it comes to technical assistance. So I want to commend you for perceiving the importance of this and to thank you for giving us all an opportunity to think more deeply about it. So for over 3 decades, technical assistance has been transformed from what was really an ad hoc, informal, sponsored United Nations project into what we now know as intellectual property scholars, a network of thousands of workshops, seminars, advisory missions with millions of practitioners around the world. 4 years ago, the World Intellectual Property Organization registered its 1 millionth participation. Just think about that, 1 millionth participation in the WIPO Academy. Technical assistance has now supported almost 100 countries with the implementation of their national intellectual property systems and architecture. This represents almost a fifth of WIPO's annual budget in terms of the millions of dollars that are allocated to technical assistance events around the world. Now, technical assistance, as Daniel mentioned in his opening remarks, was initially viewed as a temporary bridge. It was to help developing countries and actually post-war Europe meet its international obligations. That has fundamentally changed today, both in the intellectual property field and in almost all of the fields of international law. So one thing that I want us to keep in mind is that this is not a phenomenon that is unique to intellectual property, that we are seeing the pervasiveness of technical assistance, what some of my colleagues at Harvard refer to as the menace of legal experts around the world, helping countries and communities in all aspects of public international law. I think the numbers are interesting, and I want to start with a caveat that all of the numbers that my team has used are from publicly available data. Those data sets are incomplete, and one of my requests to my dear friend Edward Kwakwa is going to be to fix some of the broken links in the WIPO TA database. The project that I'm going to describe this morning and some of the insights that we've learned are a direct result of Danielle's invitation. I finally thought, okay, this has been bugging me for decades. Danielle's given me an invitation. I'm going to dive into it. So a couple of high points. Technical assistance is now a permanent feature of the intellectual property system. It's ad hoc. It's diverse. It is often the subject of heated debate, but it is permanent. And I think the idea, no matter what challenges we face, the idea that it might go away is, I think, an idea that is infeasible. In the past decade alone, 40,000 participants from developing countries attended technical assistance events. Technical assistance is woven into treaty negotiations, and as Daniel already mentioned, it fundamentally shapes international IP architecture. Now, technical assistance has evolved into a very contentious element of WIPO treaty negotiations. And while technical assistance provisions are increasingly viewed as essential for securing broad multilateral agreements, they have simultaneously emerged as a major source of conflict among member states. In the two recent WIPO treaties, debates over technical assistance created sharp divisions between negotiating coalitions with disagreements over the scope of the technical assistance provision, over the funding of the technical assistance provision, and over what kinds of programs might be implemented. And those debates overshadowed many times substantive discussions about the treaty's core administrative framework and its normative objectives. This sort of dynamic illustrates how technical assistance has really transformed. It's transformed from what was a peripheral kind of shadow in the room into a central bargaining chip that complicates the treaty-making process. The massive infrastructure of technical assistance impacts every entrepreneur and countless business owners in developing countries around the world. And this network of workshops and technical assistance seminars and advisory services, et cetera, is built with its own internal norms, its own internal ideology, and its own metrics for impact. It serves as a comprehensive sort of governance system to itself, even though its impact is global. It operates through multiple channels, funding mechanisms that are disparate, and institutional providers, all combined to create a pervasive influence that extends far beyond traditional understandings of capacity building. The generations of education, professional opportunities, and funding that is available through technical assistance creates dependencies that extend far beyond initial implementation support of a treaty, for example. It embeds external norms into the domestic institutional architecture of intellectual property, and where there is no architecture, it develops a blueprint. Today, most developing countries have not only built and sustained intellectual property systems that meet the TRIPS standard, but many developing countries have opted to create IP regimes that exceed minimum requirements. So innovation today from the increasing strength of IP laws to the growing role of developing country entrepreneurs, be it in music, in arts and craft, in TKTCEs. All of these look very different today than it did 30 years ago when the TRIPS agreement was first implemented. Technical assistance has also transformed from a benign program into what I argue is both subversive and generative. It is subversive and generative of existing infrastructure, but it is also subversive and generative of the globalized IP norms that undergird the administrative autonomy of developing countries. So the key question is, what insights and lessons are discernible from publicly available technical assistance data? And there are a couple of questions that I have on the slide. Is the TA network of activities and experts consistent with the structural and normative justifications for technical assistance? Does the extant mode of technical assistance, sustained now for 30 years since TRIPS, fit our present moment? And what exactly is the impact of technical assistance on countries most in need of innovation and entrepreneurship for development? Okay, so this is an empirical study, 25 years looking at the data. To emphasize again, the data is incomplete. For purposes of the keynote, I am not going to talk about money. Everybody say money. Money, very important subject in these days. But the reality is that to understand the flow of monies within the WTO and WIPO, particularly for technical assistance, you really need to understand what the definitions are that the accountants are using. What counts as technical assistance, what's in a TISC, what's in a funds and trust. There are all sorts of things, and the numbers, as our team began to look at this, it became very clear that the numbers don't add up. So for these purposes, or at least for my purpose this morning, I will not be talking about numbers much, except to give you a sense of just how much we're talking about. So let me give you an overview of the study. First of all, it's a comprehensive analysis of about 10,000 plus technical assistance activities. Most of our data comes from WIPO's TA database. We analyze these two periods that you see on the screen. And then, as I've mentioned several times, there are limitations to the study. There are data gaps and there are inconsistencies in the reporting. So it makes the data tough to really rely on robustly. Nonetheless, there are striking patterns that I think are worth reporting. I'm going to give you a summary of the key findings, and then I'm going to delve into some important points. First of all, technical assistance, finding number one, technical assistance may have a more limited absolute impact on domestic development. This is probably not a surprise to anyone in this room. Certainly 40 years ago, it would have been a surprise to those working in technical assistance to hear this. Remember that 40 years ago, technical assistance was not envisaged as a permanent piece of the IP architecture. It was ad hoc, it was informal, really no ideology behind it. It was not coherent in any way. So it was very impact driven. And so 40 years ago, this finding would have been a shock, I think, to those there at the beginning. What is particularly interesting is that technical assistance intensity, that is, the intensity of technical assistance, correlates negatively with resident shares of patenting and innovation. Breaking that down simply, the more technical assistance that you have does not in fact produce greater levels of resident patenting and innovation. In fact, this data supports an argument that several folks have made in the literature that the TRIPS agreement was a net benefit to the global north, that heightened standards tend not to impact domestic filers as much as external filers. This is the data that actually supports that. These were claims in the literature that had no empirical basis, and we believe that we've now been able to establish that. Second key finding. Technical assistance participation shows weak positive correlation with per capita patent rates. What's really interesting about this is that stagnant per capita innovation metrics indicate that what we have is dependency, capacity substitution, and administrative professionalization. So think of it this way. The average intellectual property office does better with foreign applicants, particularly in the industrial property space, than it does with domestic applicants. So what we see is that the professionalization, which is one key benefit of technical assistance, by the way, these offices become professionalized. The benefit of that actually does not flow to the creation of local inventive ecosystems. This is not only true for developing countries, by the way, this is true also for developed countries. We are increasingly seeing, certainly in the United States, non-resident patent filings are now higher than we've ever seen historically, and we are seeing increasingly, even within the US, although it's not a function of what we would traditionally call technical assistance, we're seeing capacity to address the needs of foreign applicants increase as well. Current technical assistance programs may displace growth, I want to say emphasis on the may, within domestic inventive communities, and may hinder the transfer of capital to the least advantaged. So one of the key problems with the map that the data suggests is that technical assistance dollars do not flow to the least advantaged. That is, they tend to go to the benefit of those who already have the capacity to engage with the IP system. So here's what I would say is the puzzle. The generative component of capacity building operates mainly through WIPO's advanced technical expertise, special and privileged information, and its ability to take advantage of professional networks to promote particular views. There has been an effort in the last decade to mitigate some of the one-sided nature of technical assistance within WIPO and the WTO, but this is still generally the case. Training programs, seminars, and repeated conference participation serve as core mechanisms to guide, to convince, and to socialize developing country lawyers, policymakers, and leaders towards specific assumptions and policy preferences. Critically, this kind of ideational battlefield has been contested with capacity building used by both proponents of quick and strong TRIPS implementation, IP maximalization, and critics advocating stronger use of TRIPS flexibility. So there's a perception that technical assistance tends to be used pretty much just by governments, and that it is skewed towards IP maximalism. The data actually suggests something different, that we're seeing that technical assistance is used by both critics and advocates, and the result actually is far less transparency in IP policymaking, particularly in Africa, but generally in LDCs. The historical analysis reveals that technical assistance has evolved from a modest, practical reality support mechanism into an ideological force that shapes the IP governance system. The combination of expanded programming, technical transformation, and sophisticated influence mechanisms has created a system that embeds external choices in domestic law and institutions with deep, lasting effects. And so as we're looking at the fourth decade of technical assistance, post-TRIPS, we've got to really think about the criteria and whether the current programming really works. So some background on the data. These slides that you will see over the next few minutes represents findings from about 10,000 plus WIPO technical assistance activities. It covers 2 periods, as I've said earlier. And what we did as a team, we built a web scraper to extract the records from WIPO's database. I don't think that's an IP violation, just so you know, Edward. Then what my team, really Carissa Chen, who is my lead research assistant, I've got to give her all the credit for this work. She then supplemented the data set with manual entries wherever we could do so. And then we faced these data gaps, as I mentioned earlier, due to broken links and some error on WIPO's sites. We tried to fix that. We actually coded something to go in to try to fix some of the links. And so the results really represent only accessible online records, not the full universe. But it's still a robust set, enough to help us figure that out. So here are some more granular key findings that I think is important, especially for the TACIP team. Even with the subset of data, with 10,000 technical assistance activities, 3 things are clear from both the empirical and the qualitative evidence. First, technical assistance has reached an unprecedented scale. It has reached an unprecedented scale with unprecedented force, with an overwhelming impact on specific geographic concentrations. It has not only grown, but it has also ideologically driven the harmonization of global norms, even when it constrains local innovative capacity. Second, technical assistance now shapes treaty bargains in ways that limit, in my view, developing countries' negotiation stakes. While technical assistance in specific treaties can be beneficial, and there are arguments for it, technical assistance actually does not appear to have much force or support from the countries that actually receive it. In other words, the Africa Group, for example, is well known to be a strong proponent, advocate of technical assistance. But as I will show you in the data, technical assistance activities actually do not flow dominantly to sub-Saharan African countries, which is, I was stunned. I will tell you that I was completely stunned. And so technical assistance just does not appear to have much force or support from the countries that receive it, and then the ones that demand technical assistance in these treaties are the ones that actually don't. It's a very bizarre picture. And finally, third, as our regressions in our data demonstrate, there's a negative correlation between the amount of technical assistance a developing country receives and the relative number of patents that it grants that comes from its own residents. So technical assistance, to repeat, has a significantly limited impact on domestic entrepreneurship and capital development. Basically, a system once designed to benefit capacity and growth may now have the potential to be a system that displaces growth in certain countries and hinders the least advantaged in the worlds of ideas and creativities. Okay, so those are the key findings. Take your picture because the slide is gone. All right. Data. So here from the WIPO database from 2014 to 2024, this is the number of technical assistance beneficiary country events. So I want you to see this slide, and I want you to note the countries on the end. Now, we empirically measured technical assistance received through 2 metrics. First, we only used data from 2014 to 2024 because of the lack of a similar data format between 2000 and 2005. So this is my other request. My poor brother and dear friend Edward is going to be like, why did I come? But okay, so request number two, number one, fix the broken links. Number two, there is not a consistency between the way that the data is reported, and so it's hard to actually do reliable comparisons. So we only measured in this slide 2014 to 2024 because the data format for 2000 to 2005 was simply not the same. So first, we measured by the number of technical assistance events where the country is listed as the venue or the host country. So if you see here, right, the venue or the host country. And this is important. Why? When you look at technical assistance activities, it may say, for example, Ethiopia is the beneficiary country. However, or the host country or the venue. But participants in that technical assistance activity could come from the entire region, right? And sometimes there are experts or observers that come from other parts of the continent. So we measured it first by the venue or host country, and then we measure it by the number of events where the country is listed as the beneficiary country, as I said. So there can be multiple beneficiary countries, even if the event is only hosted by one country. And that's the difficulty in this data. You've got to extrapolate what's really going on when you see the reports from the WTO or from WIPO. Technical assistance activities exhibit, as you will see here, pronounced concentration among select recipient nations, with countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Egypt, Mexico, India, and Thailand receiving disproportionately high volumes of programming. This is not attendance, this is just programming. The pattern demonstrates vendor-recipient co-specialization dynamics. Vendor-recipient co-specialization dynamics. Basically, once institutions internalize programmatic frameworks such as IP strategies, anybody familiar with those? Examination protocols, anybody familiar with those? And enforcement procedures, judicial training. Once a national institution internalizes these programmatic frameworks, subsequent interventions are easy. They attract subsequent interventions, and those subsequent interventions deepen institutional path dependence, creating what we would call self-reinforcing cycles of engagement that lock certain jurisdictions into particular development trajectories. The country receiving the most technical assistance activities, other than China or Brazil, is the Philippines. The Philippines serves as a case study and exemplifies how concentrated technical assistance transforms domestic institutional landscapes and policy orientations. PIPO, the Philippine Intellectual Property Office, has emerged from this data set, I was again shocked, as both a dominant recipient of capacity building initiatives and the most ardent advocate for enhanced IP protection and enforcement standards in the region. That is not a coincidence. This institutional alignment was reinforced when the office successfully lobbied for the PCT ratification in 2001, Internet Adoption Treaties in 2002, and if you look at Philippines ratification and you map it onto technical assistance, you will see a positive correlation. You will also see Philippines, very interestingly enough, this transformation was reinforced through US involvement in what we call the Agile program, where Development Alternatives, Inc., which is a little group in the US that works with the government, staff from that agency were embedded within the Philippines agency to draft plant variety protection legislation consistent with UPOF standards 1991. This ultimately was overwhelmed in spite of civic opposition and a lot of demonstration by the public. The passage of the Philippines Plant Variety Protection Act went forward in 2002. By 2005, again, if you dig deep into this case study, the concentration of specialized IP knowledge within the Philippines allowed it to monopolize IP policy within the Philippines, and today, the government systematically defers to the Philippines Patent Office when it comes to international negotiations, and other agencies like the Science Department in the Philippines, the Technology Ministry in the Philippines, the Public Health Ministry have effectively been silenced. The compliance-driven nature of assistance in the Philippines is quite striking. It shows in many ways both the statutory mandate to strengthen IP administration by creating institutional ideology where technical assistance essentially reinforced existing organizational incentives rather than broadening domestic policy considerations. So this is a case that demonstrates how technical assistance can fundamentally reshape the domestic balance of institutional power, concentrating expertise and authority in ways that persist long after the program. So this was one of our subsidiary points. There is a long tail to technical assistance. It's not like you go do judicial training, you pack up after a week and move on. The impact of that training has a really long tail institutionally, domestically, in terms of the way that power is coordinated. Okay, so here we have statistics as measured year by year. The distribution of technical assistance participants, all right, as opposed to the host country or the benefit or the venue. The participants reveals extreme concentration among populous middle-income countries. So we're here focusing on Africa. I want you to notice where the sub-Saharan African countries fall. Particularly Brazil and China are beneficiaries here, which account for the disproportionately large number of trainees. I want you to note something strange here. Everybody remember 2020 and 2021 COVID? All right. So it's interesting when you count, and our team actually went in and counted. When you count the participants that were registered, so during the COVID years, because most technical assistance was delivered virtually, these numbers went from like 55 to 300 and something. Incredible. But it tells you something about technical assistance delivery, that folks who are able to attend actually increase in terms of diversity. It's not just the patent offices or the copyright office. It's not just bureaucrats. It's not just highly specialized middle-income people. When you open it up, the interest in education and in learning about how to do entrepreneurship and how to advance their businesses, through IP actually is quite broad. So where technical assistance activities happen is important for who gets to participate, who gets to benefit. These choices are not neutral. When you host a technical assistance project in Egypt, it makes a big difference who gets there. When you host it in South Africa, when you host it in Kenya or Ghana, right? All of these make quite a difference in the absorption of the technical assistance activity. And so what the pattern here tells us is that there's what we're calling a massification of technical assistance through distance learning platforms. And WIPO actually and the WTO now have become fairly well-greased, well-functioned, equipped to do technical assistance through distance learning platform that basically allow large-scale participation and recruitment with corresponding increases in on-site activities. The WIPO Academy is the queen of the hill. Since the 2000s, the Academy has systematically scaled e-learning initiatives, creating substantial participant cohorts while reducing logistical constraints. And if you look at this heat map, technical assistance activities increased in 2016, but participation increased dramatically because, as I said, of the pandemic. All right, I'm going to move pretty quick here. Somebody's better tell me because I'm having a good time. All right. This chart shows the statistics by host of venue country disaggregated by year. And as you can see, once you disaggregate the the data by venue or host country, you can see a spike. Oops, sorry. You can see a spike. So here, around 2016 and 2017. So you'll see the spike here, right? You'll see them right here. I hope these slides are clear. What was happening in 2016, 2017? Professor Hughes was involved, to give you a hint. Marrakesh Treaty implementation. So there's a very definite spike when the Marrakesh Treaty was ratified, went into force. The 2-3 years following that, it's incredible. It's the first time, actually, the data suggests that copyright technical assistance exceeded industrial property technical assistance. It was quite dramatic, and I think that's really interesting. Now, there's a growing divide between countries like China and Brazil and poorer countries. So the period between 2000 to 2007 witnessed about, bless you, a dozen emerging economies strategically invoking compulsory licensing to deal with HIV/AIDS. This started, of course, with Mozambique, then Swaziland, then Malaysia, and then we began to see programs across Rwanda, Brazil, and Thailand. But when you look at what's happening in these countries, you're noticing that with respect to technical assistance, there was not as much technical assistance in how to use compulsory licensing or to deal with TRIPS exceptions for public health. The dramatic drop, even after the paragraph 6 negotiation, was quite interesting. Geographic distribution. I think it's interesting to note here, again, this is focusing on Africa. If you look at this map, you'll see that the geographic distribution of technical assistance reveals a pronounced regional clustering. That clustering fundamentally challenges assumptions about demand-driven capacity building. There is nothing demand-driven about this, the data suggests. There are higher participation intensities across Southeast Asia, North Africa, and selected Andean and African states. Smaller island nations who are drowning with climate change issues, quite poor, etc., exhibit notably lower engagement levels. So when you look at the spatial heterogeneity, it does not reflect an organic demand, but rather a strategic distribution of technical assistance networks. This is not demand-driven. The clustering patterns that we observed correlate strongly with what economists would call supply-side institutional factors. WIPO Academy's global programming and university partnerships, the systemic rollout of technology and innovation support centers known as TISCs under the DA, the Development Agenda Framework, and the strategic placement of WIPO external offices all serve as regional amplifiers, no question about it. These initiatives demonstrate that geographic hotspots emerge from programmatic decisions rather than recipient needs. And there's lots to say about that, but I'm running out of time. The economic profile of OAPI is actually a stark illustration of how technical assistance can override rational economic interests. So we've got 16 Francophone African nations encompassing the 12 least developed countries with lowest per capita incomes and minimal GDP figures. 600 million for Guinea-Bissau to 2 billion today. These populations are heavily dependent on agriculture, and yet all 16 rushed towards TRIPS Plus compliance over a decade ahead of their extended implementation deadlines. How did they do that? Technical assistance. With virtually no domestic innovation capacity, with HIV/AIDS infection rates approaching 1/5 of the population in some of these countries, with no pharmaceutical manufacturing capabilities, overwhelming dependence on technology imports, these countries could have easily maximized TRIPS flexibilities. Instead, we have a 1999 Bangui Agreement revision that defied economic strategy for these LDCs, revealing these complex institutional dynamics that basically transcended member-driven processes. Okay, so this is taken straight from WIPO. If you look at the IP subject areas as listed by WIPO, technical assistance programming across the major recipients demonstrates consistent compositional profiles, emphasizing generalist capacity building punctuated by specialized modules. So Brazil, China, Colombia, Egypt, and the Philippines all look the same. Like if you were just looking at the data, they all have the exact same profile. They have substantial allocations to multiple IP fields and industrial property categories, complemented by modest but growing attention to traditional knowledge, genetic resources, and TCEs. The subject matter distribution actually directly mirrors the WIPO Academy's program. So if you look at the catalog, and the technical assistance in terms of curating a role in shaping professional knowledge hierarchies, rather than neutral teaching compliance procedures, if you look at the Academy's programs, they actively determine what topics are normal for the IP professional in Africa and what topics are extra valuable within these national IP communities. So the privileging of industrial property toolkits shifts the nature of knowledge within the African landscape in particular. Okay, so I'm wrapping up a couple of final points. There's a striking paradox that challenges almost all of the literature about capacity building in developing countries. This scatter plot analysis of technical assistance shows that even against patent applications per million inhabitants, there's this weakly positive association between patent applicants per capita and total technical assistance. It's a counterintuitive finding, and that we found quite troubling. This distribution pattern in this scatter plot analysis suggests that technical assistance deployment follows supply-side considerations, including donor priorities, regional balance objectives, rather than demand-driven. More troubling is a misallocation of technical assistance on domestic innovative capacity. When you remove China and Brazil from the analysis, there's a striking negative correlation between technical assistance intensity and resident patent share. And that is interesting because it's a significant correlation coefficient of about 1/3, -1/3. That's a serious number. Second, countries receiving more technical assistance have a lower share of patents granted to their own entrepreneurs. Made this point, just wanted to show you the empirical support for that. Part of this is that intensive technical assistance may create or reinforce dependency relationships that basically crowd out domestic research. All right, last want to make a couple of comments about the specialization of IP areas. When you look at patent field analysis across developing countries, there is a striking pattern of stratification beyond simple resource constraints. So it's interesting that in Africa in particular, there is a persistence of minimal representation in biotechnology, advanced materials, pharmaceutical innovation. And so what we see instead, if you look, I hope you can see some of these, but if you look at digital communications, or some of the digital technologies, what we find is that the digital leapfrogging represents sector-specific advancement, so within sectors, rather than a comprehensive technological development. So this kind of selective modernization raises fundamental questions about whether current innovation patterns enable developing countries to build the diversified technological capacities necessary for sustained economic development. So one way to improve some of these challenges is to think about the ways in which technical assistance correlates only to specific kinds of sectors versus the sort of diffusion of innovation that would be helpful for overall development. So ultimately, stratification technologically, if you look at TA intensity versus domestic innovation, again, we see technological hierarchy, but also we see that there is this stratification. And part of what we want to do is to think about the ways in which intensity of technical assistance actually produces greater diffusion. And if you look here, because we have no data for 2005 to 2016, this is not as robust a result, but you will see ultimately that most of the African countries represented here have the same negative correlation. And you see this with the stratification here again on this spatial map. So what can we learn from relative specialization, from stratification, from sector-specific technical assistance? A couple of takeaways, and then I wrap up. Technical assistance as currently structured reflects more than institutional ambivalence. It represents a framework that in many cases could undermine the development prospects of developing countries. These outdated assistance models is not just about limiting capacity, but it actively undermines countries most in need of genuine development support. It simply is incomprehensible that the countries that are the poorest are the countries that receive the least technical assistance act. It makes no sense. There are ways that this damage is long-term. As I said, technical assistance has a long tail. First is it captures human capital. The number of African students in WIPO's academy who undertake the study of intellectual property with no basic knowledge in social sciences, humanities, or economics is staggering. So what you produce are bureaucrats who understand the ideological arguments but have no capacity to translate them into meaningful policy frameworks on the continental level. This is a problem because it takes generations to replace that kind of educational problem. It's what we really think of in my team as a novel form of brain drain, where the people are not leaving the country, but the knowledge that they've gained is simply insufficient to address the socioeconomic needs of the nation. The subsidiary point is that the knowledge exhibits increasing returns to scale. All right? Countries must develop indigenous innovation capacity rather than simply importing these institutional legal frameworks from outside. Second, higher prices of essential goods. Enhanced IP enforcement almost always follows systematic price increases. This is the case in pharmaceuticals. I don't need to spend time on that at all. The third takeaway, we have network externalities. Technical assistance in developing countries tends to create these dependency relationships that reverse capital flows. And this is a problem because these joint networks tend to be controlled by firms outside the countries. Fourth takeaway, lack of options to support indigenous knowledge growth. If technical assistance is merely supporting existing forms of intellectual property, existing channels, and existing institutions, then indigenous innovative growth simply has no support. That the flow of technical assistance is inverted, and that's a problem. And then we have basically the importance of creating programs that serve development objectives. We need to acknowledge the harmful dynamics of existing practices. We need to understand the way that these frameworks have been transformed. And ultimately, we must remember that current frameworks that guide developing countries reverse traditional development assistance flows, with countries providing their most valuable 21st century assets, their user bases, their data, their networks, their digital economic footprints. They're providing those in ways that strengthen networks outside the continent rather than algorithms and networks within the continent. Thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much for the education. I must admit that I've been well educated today. Now, we don't have much time, so I'll give the floor to Edward. He's the first to raise his hands. Do we have the mic working? Good. For questions, and then we have Justin also raising. So Edward first, please, and then
Justin doesn't get any questions.